Chapter 5 From Green to Brown. As Maudie neared the water pump to draw water for Mother, she felt something hit her dress. She looked down at a large, brownish-green grasshopper clinging to her skirt. Instinctively, she reached to knock it off, but then jerked her hand back in fright. It was the largest grasshopper Maudie had ever seen. Suddenly, even to her own surprise, she began screaming at the top of her voice. "Maudie, Kind, was ist let's?" Meaning, "Child, what's wrong?" Mother cried as she ran across the porch and down the steps. "I don't know," Maudie screamed. "Grasshoppers! Grasshoppers!" Instantly, Mother was at her side, jerking at her clothing in a vain attempt to find the offending grasshopper. "No!" Maudie screamed. "Down there!" She pointed to the bottom of her skirt. "Where?" Mother asked in a skeptical tone of voice. "I don't see anything." Maudie cautiously looked at her skirt. Unshed tears stood trembling on her eyelids and threatened to spill over. "It was right there, just a while ago," she said rather sheepishly. "Well, you shouldn't scream so. Just over a little grasshopper," Mother reprimanded her. "It wasn't a little grasshopper. It was this big and had great big eyes and the biggest feelers you ever saw," Maudie exclaimed, her hands widening with every word. "Well, anyway, you shouldn't scream like that when you get scared," Mother said. Maudie was silent, but inwardly she didn't think that she had ever screamed before. She looked at the ground and squirmed her bare toe in the fine dust. Just then another grasshopper flew through the air and landed on Mother's skirt. "Look, Mother, there's another one." "Unvergleichlich," meaning weird, Mother exclaimed. She knocked the giant grasshopper from her skirt with a mighty swing. "Was the one on your dress that big?" "It was bigger than that," Maudie answered importantly. Secretly, she was glad another grasshopper had flown onto Mother's skirt to redeem her screaming spell. Just then another one flew past and landed on the pump handle. "Oh, look, Mother! At the pump!" Dozens of large grasshoppers swarmed over the rough boards that covered the well. Even as they watched, more grasshoppers fell from the sky. Mother and Maudie looked upward and saw a strange glittering in the bright summer sun. "Oh, no!" Mother groaned in anguish. Maudie looked toward the barnyard and saw the chickens and turkeys chasing after the grasshoppers as though they had discovered a new game. In the silence, they heard a sickening plop, plop, plop of more grasshoppers falling onto the yard around them. Never had they seen such a sight. "I hope they don't get the corn," Mother said in a flat voice. Maudie felt panic rising within her again and tried to suppress the tears that threatened to choke her. She knocked another grasshopper from her skirt with such force that it flew straight out and hit the porch rail with a hard knock. Gradually, the glittering in the sky disappeared, and only frightening chomp, chomp, chomping could be heard as millions of tiny mouths were chewing up the landscape. Tobe, Dan, and Jake hurried in from the field. They too were concerned. The corn was just shooting ears, too green to pick, so they could do nothing but watch the beautiful crop disappear before them. Never had they known such utter hopelessness. That evening, Maudie dejectedly milked Bessie. She suddenly sat up straight and tall when she heard a strange squealing noise. Bessie lifted her head too and twitched her ears in alarm. What could it be? Then beneath the squealing sound, Maudie heard the familiar grum, drum, 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 grum, drum, drum, drum of the train. Puzzled, she ran to the corner of the barn to watch and was astonished to see the train inching slowly across the prairie. Its wheels were squashing and slipping over the grasshoppers that crowded the rails. A helpless and sickening feeling lay heavy within her as she turned back to finish milking. That evening, Father came home from his carpentry job. After discussing the problem with Mother and the boys, he decided to go to Buckland the next morning to see if he could find anything that would kill the insects. The next day seemed unbearably long. The landscape was turning from green to brown before their very eyes. At last, Father drove in the long, dusty lane with several tubs of citrus fruit and 2 bags of poison on the back of the wagon. He had gotten them from the county agent and knew it was their only hope. The whole family immediately set to work stirring the poison into the tubs of citrus. Then they drove out across the fields and scattered the poisoned fruit along the fences. They enjoyed listening to the grasshoppers jumping on the little oranges and lemons and devouring them in minutes. But alas, the poison was too late to save the crops. Not a green blade of grass or stalk of corn was spared. Only 1 ear of corn could be found in the entire field, and it was a small one. The destruction covered the entire prairie, afflicting everyone. The next Sunday, their church service was held in the home of Abe Koblenz. They did not have a church building, but met in the Amish homes. After singing 2 songs, the minister, Jacob Miller, rose to his feet and stood in the doorway between the living room where the adults sat and a bedroom where the youth were listening. "Brothers and sisters," he spoke in comforting tones, "all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." Romans 8:28. The congregation listened with aching hearts, disappointment etched deeply on their faces. Do not think of this as a punishment for sin, but rather as a blessing from God. Anything that draws our hearts closer to God is a blessing, Jacob continued. Maudie listened attentively. Usually she was not able to understand much of what the minister said, for he spoke in High German and in a hurried and clipped manner. But today he spoke in everyday Pennsylvania Dutch, and time passed quickly. He encouraged them to look to God for help during this time of hardship. Almost before Maudie realized it, the closing prayer and songs were over, and the benches were being pushed back against the walls. She rose stiffly and walked outside to be with her friends. A long table was stretched out in the kitchen, and hot bean soup was placed upon it, along with tomatoes, pickled beets, and fresh bread. The children ate first, then the menfolk and teenage boys, and last of all, the women and girls. They lingered over the meal and talked pleasantly. If a stranger had looked in on them there, he would not have guessed that they had just experienced one of the most crushing disappointments of the year. In their hearts, they knew that God was in control, and they felt at peace. They would pull together as a community. The little children ran and played in the yard, and all too soon it was time for the Borntregers to leave. As the family headed homeward, Jake said, "You can't guess what Mose Troyer did today." "It's hard telling," Sarah replied. "He took us boys out to their buggy and showed us a little cardboard box that had 2 dead grasshoppers in it, and they were every bit of 6 inches long." "Why?" Maudie asked. "He said he's going to send it to Michigan to his brother Dave and tell him that that's what our team of horses looks like out here in Kansas." "Oh my," Sarah exclaimed. "Why, they'll stink by the time they get there." "That's what somebody else told him, and he said that all work horses stink a little." "Oh," Maudie groaned, shaking her head, but the boys doubled over with laughter, and soon Maudie and Sarah had to join them. Somehow attending church lifted their spirits, and today was no exception. Even Father smiled, in spite of the fact that his crop of corn was destroyed. Even though it would be impossible to feed his present herd of livestock without it, he knew they would manage somehow. They might have to sell some of the cows and calves, but they would not go hungry. With the help of God and his family, they would survive. Several weeks passed, and again it was Sunday morning. Church was held at the David Borntrager home north of Buckland. While the congregation was sitting in the living room, they noticed a thick cloud of black smoke rising to the east of them. They watched and wondered what could possibly be burning at that time of the year, for the prairie was quite dry. No one in their right mind would light a fire in these conditions, and certainly not on a Sunday. Soon all eyes were on the smoke, and Jacob stopped his sermon to question whether it was serious. "It looks like it might be at our house," Maudie's Uncle Dan said as he rose to his feet and looked worriedly out of the window. Black columns of smoke billowed up from the prairie and swept southward. Aunt Fanny gasped and hurried to the bedroom for her bonnet and those of her daughters, Sadie and Lizzie. The little girls clutched tightly to their mother's skirt, making it almost impossible for her to get the baby. "We left that cowboy at home, and he must have had trouble," Dan mumbled as he grabbed their boy's hand. "Why did you have a cowboy at your house?" Jacob asked. "He's my nephew, but he's been out west for a long time cowboying. He just showed up at our place Friday and didn't want to come to church this morning, so I told him he could stay at home," he informed his curious friends. "I sure wonder what happened," he added as he hurried through the doorway. In an instant, everyone came to life. Church forgotten, men ran to the barn to get their horses, mothers grabbed their babies, and the older children scurried here and there, frightened and confused. "Come here, Maudie," Mother called. "What?" Maudie asked with wide, wondering eyes. "Take my diaper bag while I get Mary and go on out to the front porch. But be careful to stay out of other people's way, and don't go to the buggy until I come." "What's burning?" Maudie asked. "We don't know. Now, go on, Maudie. You can ask questions later." The children piled into the back seat and sat quietly. Father helped Mother into the buggy before running around to the other side. He jumped into the front seat with such force the buggy rocked up and down and back and forth, causing Dolly to stumble and step back a few steps. Father cracked the reins over her back, and she jerked forward at a run with small stones flying from beneath the wheels. Fear clutched at Maudie's throat, making it hard to swallow. Now they could see that it was indeed Uncle Dan's house that was burning. The flames shot high into the air. Fierce black smoke billowed upward, boiling angrily before sweeping out and over the prairie. Dolly grew nervous and jumped sideways at every loose stone in the road or when someone spoke. Father slapped the reins unmercifully over her back, trying to urge her on. Just as they neared Uncle Dan's property, they gasped in horror as the roof buckled inward and then, with a great shower of sparks, crashed to the floor. Father jumped from the buggy and ran fast toward the house. Maudie was afraid that he would go inside. But then he turned toward the barn, and for the first time Maudie saw Aunt Fanny and the children standing safely behind it. In another instant the rest of the family jumped from the buggy too and ran toward them. Only Tobe had the presence of mind to tie Dolly to a fence post. Maudie wondered where Uncle Dan was. She looked around, and then saw him close by the house, peering into the flames. Fanny was crying and tried to tell Father what had happened, but Maudie could not understand much of what she said. She heard others murmur something about a tramp. "Did a tramp burn their house down?" Maudie asked Sarah. "I don't know. It must have been that cowboy Uncle Dan talked about. I couldn't hear what Aunt Fanny said." Father looked toward the house where the fire raged fearfully, then suddenly ran to join Uncle Dan. Maudie's heart jumped to her throat. They were much too close for safety, and she was afraid that more of the house would tumble down. How she wished they would step back. "Oh, it's just terrible! It's just terrible!" Aunt Fanny wailed in a sing-song voice. Mother put her arm around her shoulders and tried to console her, but she only wailed louder. Father and Uncle Dan came back, shaking their heads sadly. "There's no life in there," Uncle Dan told them, and Maudie saw tears trembling on his eyelids. "Don't take it so hard, Fanny." Maudie reached out and touched Father's rough hand. "Was there somebody in there?" she asked him. "Yes, Maudie," he answered in a low voice. "There was a tramp in there." "Did he get burned up?" "Yes." "Why didn't he get out?" "He didn't want to." Maudie was appalled. She couldn't imagine anyone wanting to burn up. She wondered if he lit the fire on purpose. He must have, for how else would it have started while Uncle Dan's were at church? Poor Aunt Fanny, and Sadie and Lizzie. Now all their belongings were gone. Their dishes, clothes, beds, and all their food. They had some furniture that had been passed down for several generations, things they had brought all the way from Ohio, and now they were burned up. And just because of that tramp. Maudie could hardly believe that anyone would do such a thing. She listened intently as Aunt Fanny again tried to speak. Her voice was now more calm and easier to understand. "He came Friday morning and seemed so nervous and acted real strange." She sniffled and with shaking hands wiped her nose and eyes with a rumpled handkerchief. "This morning we asked him to come to church with us, but he said he was too tired and wondered if he could just rest here while we're gone. You know, we never thought he might do something like this." People crowded close to hear her words. "The corner there by the bedroom was really burning fast when we got here," Uncle Dan took up where she left off. "I tried my best to go in and get him, but I just couldn't." He paused as he remembered the horror of discovering their home in flames and not knowing where his nephew was. "I ran around to the bedroom and called to him. Then through the flames, I saw him lying on a pile of coal that was on top of the bed with some kerosene cans standing beside him. I think he was dead then already." Aunt Fanny added, "Dan called to him to come out, but he never answered him. He screamed as loud as he could, but the boy never made a sound." Wearily she rubbed a grimy hand over her eyes as though to wipe away the memories and regrets. "If only we hadn't left him here alone." "You didn't know he'd do this, Fanny," Father reassured her in a gruff voice. "Why don't you go home with Mother and the girls now? The boys and I will stay and help Dan with the chores. Tomorrow we'll come back with others and clean up. Then the church will get together and build a house for you." Maudie squeezed into the back seat of the buggy between Sarah and Gidley and held Sadie on her lap. Even after they were far away from the burning house, she still seemed to hear the crackling and roaring of the flames. She closed her eyes to shut out the memories, but then the orange and yellow flames seemed to dance before her. Maudie shifted her position and stared unseeingly across the flat prairie. She blinked her stinging eyes and tried to swallow the lump in her throat. Maudie wanted to cry. End of chapter 5.